The great thing about AI is it delivers the translations almost in real time, and that's very useful. It's baked into all of our processes that we use, all of our translation workflows.
Hello, friends. Welcome to a new episode of Merging Minds powered by BureauWorks, your AI powered TMS. Today, I am thrilled to have one of my localization industry friends here with us, my friend Brian McConnell. Hey, Brian.
Hey
Welcome.
there,
How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. You?
Yeah, good. Myself, I'm traveling. I've been a nomad for the last 6, 7 months. I find myself at my parents' place. This is the only place that I could call home right now, and I'm about to start a new trip to the U.S. this week. So, where are you based now?
Right now, I'm in Baltimore visiting my dad, and headed up to New York and Toronto for a localization meetup later in the week, and back to San Francisco.
You normally live in San Francisco. Yeah. All right. Are you native from which part of the United States?
Baltimore, actually. So I grew up here and moved out to California once I graduated from college.
Oh, nice. Can you tell us a bit about your background? And the question that I always like to start our interviews with is like, how the hell did you come across the localization industry? Because I am a lawyer, and you've seen people here that have passed by this podcast who never studied. They studied business administration, they studied tourism, or they studied whichever career, or they didn't even study, and they're in the localization industry and are leading teams or companies. So what is how do you tell us about your background, and how do you come across the industry, please?
Yes, so I kind of got into it accidentally, although I've always been interested in language technology. So I studied electrical engineering and finance in college, and started my career writing software for telecommunications platforms. And so about this would have been about 15 years ago, or maybe a bit longer than that. Um, you know, Back in the old day, it cost you $1.50 a minute to make a phone call. Internationally, to pretty much anywhere, but as we started developing systems that allowed you to communicate by voice or video over the internet, all those geographical barriers went away. And so, you'd create a product, and then all of a sudden you'd have customers from like 10 companies or countries wanting to use it. And so I was getting a little bit bored with telephones at that time because there's only so much you can do with a phone system, and realized that pretty much any web or internet based service, could just organically attract an international user base. And I'd also, like, even way back in my college days, had been playing around with machine translation, and just decided this would be an interesting pivot. And so that's what got me into doing localization work. And I started out working on it was an open source project called the Worldwide Lexicon, which is sort of a precursor for cloud-based TMS platforms. It blended human and machine translation, and it's also based on Google App Engine, in its early days. And so it's an interesting technical project. Didn't really go anywhere as a product, but that's what got me into localization. So
Nice. I still remember those huge bills when you were calling the US or England from when I was raised in Spain. Oh my God. Thank God for people like you that allowed us to use internet in that way.
yeah, it's pretty nuts what phone companies used to charge.
Yeah, yeah. So now, I mean, you started your own company recently, but before that, because I want to talk a lot about that today. I want to present your new journey, etc. But I want to go down a little bit memory lane, so to say,
Mhm.
because I know you working in some big tech companies in the Silicon Valley, leading the globalization effort there. Can you tell us about this before we get into your new venture?
Yeah, so I'm based in San Francisco, so it's approximate to a lot of the startup activity in the computer industry. And so I sort of carved out a niche for myself, building out localization teams at not necessarily big companies, but I mean they're big companies now, but they weren't at the time that I was working for them. So I built out the localization team and tech and everything at about a half dozen startups, including some pretty well-known names like Lyft, Medium, Notion, and then a number of smaller companies. And typically, what would happen is, they would get an ask from management to start going into other languages or regions, and really have no idea where to get started with that. And then they usually also had a lot of tech debt that they had to deal with. And so I would typically get brought in at that point to help them get everything organized and work through all that. And every company is different. Some had a pretty well thought out strategy for expanding internationally. Others were kind of reactive and just trying to figure things out. But So I did that a number of times, and then started this new business, which we can talk about in a bit.
Yeah, I remember having conversations with you. We've been friends for a certain amount of years, and I remember having a conversation with you about this precise topic about how companies, how there are two models of companies, right? Those that are globalization prepared from the beginning, and those who are reactive, as you said, and then the struggles and the money and investments that it brings to be reactive, right? I remember having this conversation with you because you were the one that put this idea in my mind, right?
Yeah, I would say very few companies are actually globalization ready from the beginning. I mean, Notion was one of the few companies that was, and that was mainly because the founders from China and just understood, from the beginning that being accessible in other languages is like, if you want to be a global company, you have to do it. Most companies, they only get there later. They start to get a lot of traction in a country, and then they're like, oh, we're not even in French, but we have all these users there. Well, like, I guess we should do something about that. And so
Yeah, yeah. And now, like it's super interesting, and some of the guests that have been here in the podcast, and something that I personally value a lot is that spirit of entrepreneur. Like, and you've given that leap of faith, right? You've taken
mm,
that leap of faith. You've gone entrepreneurial, right?
yeah, although it's not my first time doing this. I started my career running telecom related businesses. My first company was a company called Phone Zone, which is basically an online catalog of business telephone systems and related accessories. It was actually one of the first e-commerce companies, I guess. And so I've always liked working in small business, and so for me, it's kind of going back to my original career in a way, just in a different industry.
So we're recording in September 24, but as far as I know, you started this business in early 2024, correct? You've named your company Localization Technology Partners.
Yeah. Yeah. So the company officially started at the beginning of the year, and I've been thinking about doing this for a number of years. But when Notion came along, it's like, you know what, that's a great opportunity. So I'm going to pursue that for a couple of years. But this has been in the works for a while.
Yeah. So you founded a company that is whose aim is to help small to mid-sized startups with localization, right? What is the primary goal for this business in the next couple of years?
So the basic premises of the business is to provide, localization program management is really as a turnkey service. So the thing I saw at nearly all of the companies I worked with or talked to, what would typically happen, the company would realize, oh, we need to start adding languages, and then they would tap kind of a random product manager typically and be like, oh, hey, Alex, you speak Spanish, right? Yeah. Oh, you're in charge of launching languages. And so then you have this person that had no prior experience with localization. Typically, nobody in the company has prior experience with it or very little. And so they just hit this really steep learning curve, where they don't know anything about the supply chain, which vendors do what. And it's just, it's really complicated for somebody who hasn't been exposed to it before. And so what I'm doing with this new company is basically providing, essentially turnkey localization program manager that can just come in, get everything set up correctly, vendors, technology, training engineers, all that stuff, so they can get to market a lot faster and avoid a lot of the mistakes that people make when they, if they just basically go to Google and try to find things out on the fly. So in a way, it's almost like a SaaS platform. It's basically a fractional employment model, because that's the other thing. Most small to mid-sized companies really don't need a full-time localization team. I mean, they need a lot of expertise and they need part-time support. But having a senior program manager there 40 hours a week, that doesn't make sense in a lot of cases, until they get to a certain size anyway.
Mhm. It's very interesting. And can you explain us how your turnkey localization program stands out in the market, especially for those startups? Or what is your vision on this? How is this going to be really stand out as a product?
Well, I think the thing that distinguishes it, there are a couple of things. One, as you know, there are a lot of vendors that, localization isn't a very vertically integrated space. It's not like there's an Amazon or Microsoft that really does everything. There's hundreds of companies that do different pieces of it. So you have your translation management platforms, and then you have video platforms, and then you have, like hundreds of LSPs that all have different specialties. And so depending on the customer's needs, they need a different, mix of those solutions. And so essentially what we're doing is providing all of that as an integrated service, so they don't really have to, learn about the supply chain to the extent, that somebody's like, directly responsible for running the program. And I'd say the other differentiating thing is, my background is technical. I'm not a linguist. I mean, I read other languages, but I've never been a professional translator. And so what that enables us to do, because most companies typically have a lot of engineering work to do upfront, especially if it's, if it's a software based company, that's usually a lot of tech debt and it needs to be dealt with. And that's something that a lot of the language industry companies aren't really very well equipped to help them with. So that combination of integrated portfolio of services plus, technical expertise, that's sort of our differentiator.
Yeah, yeah. So typically, how long would it take you to establish that program? Let's say you onboard a client tomorrow, you sign a client tomorrow. When are they up and running? When can they?
So, I mean, most of the core services we can have up and running in, a matter of a couple of weeks. Now, the issue is, typically what happens with software companies, while they're figuring out, like, product market fit and, getting their customer base and everything, they'll tend to run fast with their software development, so that they'll be lazy about doing things like, externalizing user facing messages. So they'll have like hard coded English messages all over the place in their code base. So that effort to clean that up will typically take, 3 to 6 months. It's less if it's a company that was thinking about this early on, but like, spoiler alert, pretty much nobody does that. Um, and then kind of in the worst case scenario, like Lyft is a good example of this. They had been operating in English for probably 5 years, and they had just this really complex, collection of services that were all managed by different teams. And so it took like 18 months to, get everything cleaned up there. But most companies, I'd say 3 to 6 months, they could be launching languages. And But the core services and vendors can all be up and running in a couple of weeks, so they can start building around it and getting ready to launch almost immediately.
Yeah, yeah. And I gotta ask you this: is the age of AI, of artificial intelligence right now? Right? We got started recently, like with LLMs, like not long ago. I cannot wait to see what's gonna happen in 20 years. How this is gonna impact us all in localization and in life, right? But at this point, if your client comes to you and says, "Hey, we have an AI mandate, for example, you want to work with us? What part of AI are you implementing in the programs as well? What part of how is AI going to be a part of the whole game, so to say?"
Well, the interesting thing about that is machine translation has been around since the 1960s, literally. So if you look up the history of Sistran. It's been around for a long time. It's very primitive, up until, about 7 years ago when Neural MT came out. But it's kind of interesting that, LLMs are a direct descendant of a lot of work that was done on machine translation. Google, in particular, was a leader in that area. So whenever customers ask about AI, I say, well, AI is just baked into everything at this point. But that said, it's generally not a good idea to rely on unsupervised AI translation. But there's all sorts of variations on human in the loop translation, depending on the type of content and and everything else. But the great thing about AI is it delivers the translations almost in real time, and that's very useful. So, like what I typically did at companies that I work for is we would have what I call a fixed forward workflow, where we'd
Hmm.
get a quick machine translation, and then that would get post edited and reviewed. And there might have been multiple steps of review, but that initial translation would be visible almost immediately. And then if somebody was really paying attention and reloading that particular help center article, they would notice, oh, okay, the translations are sort of updating over time. But the reality was that most customers, as long as the translations were good enough, and accurate, we never got complaints, if somebody stumbled on a, AI translation, because by the time they complained about it, it would have been edited anyway.
And yeah, we hear this precise thing that you just mentioned all the time in the localization industry, right? We've been there. Like, there's been this fear that sparked and that started like this fear of AI when it's a tool, like thinking that it's going to substitute everything. So, but this makes me think of a thing, Brian. It's like, uh, having this in mind, how would you pitch that to your client? Say like, hey, on top of this, or I can come up with a solution that includes all this and the AI. How would you pitch that to your client?
Well, I mean, the main pitch for the client, because a lot of times, again, these companies are fairly early in the localization process, and their mandate is we need to ship 5 languages as quickly as possible. So they're generally, in a weird way, less concerned with unit costs. So if I get a question about, oh, we can use AI to do everything for free, I'll generally be like, okay, next, just because they're not really thinking the right way anyhow about internationalization. But what AI is really good for is speed. So it's like if you want to get something in the market quickly, that's a really good way, to get draft copy and then improve on it over time. And then I guess my other pitch with AI is like, it's baked into all of our processes that we use, and we can adjust it as needed. So you don't really need to overthink about how AI is being used. It's there in the background, and like I said, just baked in, all of our translation workflows.
Mhm.
Does that
One of
answer
the things.
your
Oh, sorry.
question?
Say that again. Sorry.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, yes, totally. And it made me think as well of I mean, moving on. I thought as well of asking you about one thing, because there's one thing you mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation is like a part of the services that you are providing that you think is they're key to establishing a localization from scratch in startups is like the proper training of the staff, right? And I wanted to ask you, like, how are you thinking, or how are you thinking of measuring that effectiveness of the training you provide to the EDP staff? What impact do you hope it has on their work?
So training, there are a couple of things. There's technical training, which is just about making sure people are aware of, best practices for, how you manage, human language content within an application, and all the usual internationalization stuff like date time formatting. I mean, this is kind of a curious thing. Like even the people who went to the best computer science programs in the world, they never get any kind of training in localization. Like not even like a 1 or 2 day breakout from one of their classes where they just cover. It's
Don't forget that the first question is like, how do you stumble upon the industry, right? The question we always ask, and you have to always ask a professional in the location industry, how the hell did you find that industry, right? It's
yeah.
not something that is mainstream or right. Sorry to have something, but that's
Yeah, but it's just weird that, like, making software ready to, operate in multiple regions, you would think would be something that they would just have like just not even a class, but just a mini course, and like, hey, just do these things, and, you won't screw yourself. But, that's part of the reason I have a job. So I can't complain about that too much. So part of the training is just like technically focused. And then, the other thing I do is talk to companies about, their hiring practices. So, for example, um, it's pretty well known in the software development world that a lot of the developers are bilingual or multilingual. And so I encourage clients to think strategically when they're hiring. I mean, it's of course it's illegal to hire based on somebody's national origin or race or anything like that, but it's totally okay to ask about language skills. So for example, if you anticipate that you're going to go into the Asia Pacific region, and you've got several candidates who are equally qualified, and there's one that's a Japanese speaker, seriously consider hiring a Japanese speaker, because they're going to be very useful when you start launching your product in Japan, and working through all sorts of weird technical issues that will come up, um, whereas an English speaking programmer wouldn't really know what to look for, if that
it's
makes
very
sense.
interesting that you mentioned the equally qualified part of it as well, right? Yeah, and the like, I'm personally a very big defender of the meritocracy in terms of hiring and achievements, right? So I like that you mentioned that, and I think that's a very, like, very human modern way of putting it as well, right? Like, to not to live
Yeah,
on those.
I also just think it's something you can do kind of opportunistically. I mean,
Yes.
because you typically, you'll be interviewing a bunch of people, and above a certain level, it's hard to say who's the best candidate anyway.
Yeah, yeah,
And so that could be the kind of thing that's like, okay, well, we've got three really good people, and this candidate, is a native Japanese speaker, and we're planning to go in Japan, and he could potentially help us, or she could potentially help us out quite a bit. Um, just making the product look really good in that language. Even if you never hire them specifically to work on localization, it's really common to pull engineers onto projects for a couple weeks or a few months, and that would
yeah,
be the kind of person you could bring into an effort around a new country launch.
yeah. And I gotta ask you, like you've been on this venture of yours for almost 10 months. It's not even a year. It's and I want to ask you about challenges and two types of challenges. Like one challenge uh, that you faced when onboarding a client, and a challenge that you faced once it's onboarded.
Yeah, so the challenges I'm dealing with right now, one is, I'd say the number one thing is finding customers at the right place and time.
Yes.
Because as we all know, localization is just a weird, industry, and a lot of companies don't even know what to search for. And and that's compounded by the fact that a lot of the early stage companies, they'll just put a product manager on it, and so there's not anybody you can contact at the company, because if you called the switchboard, quote unquote, they'd be like, I don't know who's working on that. And there's so much noise on the internet, it's like, there's not really an obvious marketplace to go to. It's not like there's this website that everybody goes to for localization stuff, if you even know what it is. So I'd say that's my number one challenge. And then the number two challenge is, it's a timing thing. The sales cycle for localization tends to be pretty long, and so I kind of, when I started the company, I'd say I really started it at the beginning of April, because I took a couple months off. I expected the typical customer sales cycle to be around 6 months. So I mean, because what happens a lot is a company they kind of go through stops and starts.
Yes.
They'll
Yes.
start looking into it, and then the next quarter priorities change, and it'll be like, hey, we're going to look at this in fourth quarter. So it's just all about pounding the pavement, and staying in front of people without being too obnoxious.
Very, very correct. And I've always defended. I think I've been asked about this a couple of occasions, and what my opinion was in terms of like how to deal with the situations. Like I've asked my mentors, like probably you've met Renato Berinato. He's a big mentor of mine, and he's been in a father figure and a founding member of the localization industry. I've always asked him, like, hey, I've come across these two problems. First problem is that I don't have any leads. How can I create them? And now my problem is that I have too many leads. Like, how can I work with them better, right? And the solution, quote unquote, the solution that we always found the most interesting to come up with is like, nothing is good or bad. You have to always be creating opportunities, because you don't know. Not even the person that is going to buy from a software company like us, from a solution like yours, unless they're very ready to buy right now, are going to move on, right? So the difference to be successful, and that's my little take, is create more opportunities, more opportunities. Don't say that you're going to qualify somebody. They are qualifying you, firstly.
Yeah.
And secondly, I think that the conversations will always evolve for good or for bad, and you need to create more. That's the only thing that makes the
Well,
success,
I think
right?
the value we offer is that it's more than just a technology solution. I mean, essentially, they're hiring me. Also, I have a network of people around me that I'm bringing into the business, and so they'll have, basically, they can hire, like, senior localization talent that can help them, basically make them look like a hero. So
Hmm.
you have that kind of product manager persona that's been tasked with rolling out a localization program, launching whatever number of languages. They're in a position where they don't want to make a mistake, right? So that gives them an excuse to, not an excuse, but they're going to take their time evaluating vendors, because they don't know who's who. and they're not familiar with a lot of the terminology, and that slows everything down. Whereas what we can do is, I mean, we can go in, we already know like which vendors are good for different use cases, and can just boom, 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 get everything set up very quickly, and then start executing versus just getting stuck in planning cycles. So it's less about selling them on a particular technical solution and selling them on like I and the people around me can really help you get this program out the door, and then save time to market, save money by not wasting money on vendors you don't need, and all these other things that they'd be worried about making a mistake with. So
It's very interesting what you mentioned now about that localization expert network that you have, that once you're in the industry you could have. How do you plan to cultivate it?
well, I mean, there's a lot of people looking for work, and one of the things I'm doing with this business is I'm trying to get ahead of a trend, because I think first of all, in small to mid-sized companies, as I mentioned before, it doesn't really make sense to have a full-time team. It doesn't really make sense for the company from a budgeting and expense standpoint, but it also doesn't really make sense for the people working there, because what ends up happening is they end up being underutilized. So problem number one, you get bored. You're just sitting there, especially if you have good process automation set up. I mean, literally, you're just on the phone with your vendors a few times a week just to make sure they're prioritizing, work correctly, and a few other things. The second problem is you just have a big fat target on your back for a layoff. And local, it's sad because localization adds, I mean, it's a huge value lever, but unfortunately what happens in a lot of companies, they'll have a reorg, and then it gets classified as a cost center, and the first thing they do is just axe the team and downsize it. And so one of the things I'm looking to do with this business is basically provide a good solution for companies, but also provide a good solution for localization professionals, because that
Mhm.
way they can effectively be working for multiple companies and not just be worried about like, did I pick the right startup? Because a lot of mid-sized startups, or small and mid-sized startups, I mean, for any number of reasons, the business might not work out that well, and then you end up paying the price for that. Whereas
Yeah.
if you're working for half a dozen different companies in varying various capacities, that risk is much smaller.
Yeah. It's super interesting. I just have a couple of more questions, and one is like for those who want who hear this podcast or see this podcast and would like to reach out to you for a consultation. What is the best way to get to you?
So our website is at Loctech Partners. That's LOCTECH partners.com. There's also a sizable knowledge base there. So definitely, feel free to take a look at the knowledge base. That'll answer a lot of questions for you. And then just set up a book an appointment online. I'm happy to talk to people.
And one last question: any final thoughts on the future of localization you want to provide to those startups who start hearing about it right now and they say like, "Oh, we need to look into that."
Well, I think one of the things that's happening is that localization as a standalone specialty is, I think it's going to get kind of merged in with managing content in general. It'll just be an aspect of managing content, whatever it is, rather than a dedicated department. I mean, larger companies, it's a different thing. I mean, larger companies, they need to have a dedicated team that just works on that. But I think small to mid-sized companies, this is just a function will be blended in with whoever's managing your health center, marketing site, and everything else.
And like for example, and I came across another question. Something popped in my mind. Like once you start working with a new client right now, right? You set him up. You could set him up in a couple of weeks to get started at least. But what would be the lifespan of that relationship that you would have with the client?
Well, it evolves over time. So, with most tech-oriented companies, the first 3 to 6 months would be working through like the different technical issues, getting the right tooling in place, refactoring their software, just all the basic nuts and bolts that you need to do to ship a multilingual product. And then after that, the focus typically shifts to language releases. So you'll start out with like one or two languages, like Spanish in the U.S., and then the next batch, will be a larger batch of languages. And typically companies will roll out a few languages at a
Mhm.
time, and then eventually get to a point where it's in kind of a stable state where it's just running on autopilot. And I mean, one of the nice things then is they don't necessarily need, like, they don't have a full time person sitting around just basically working part time. So, um, the way things are structured is their customers own all of their relationships with their vendors. So tech and service providers, they own all those contracts, and we're not in the middle as a reseller or anything like that. Um, so one of two things, well, one of three things will happen. Either the customer will, not work out, and the product dies, and they just kind of have to shut it down. That
Mhm,
happens in startups. The second thing that can happen is they'll get to a certain number of languages where they feel like they're in a good state in terms of reaching their addressable market, and then they just need somebody around to kind of keep the lights on, which is that's a great like what we offer is a great solution for that. And the third case would be the company really breaks out and takes off, and they want to bring the program in house. And we set things up so they can do that. I mean, because like I said, they own all the relationships, and if you know if they outgrow us, that's fine.
mhm,
I would say the majority of customers will end up in bucket number two and just be happy to have us handle it, and then a few will grow big enough that they'll want to bring it in house. Like no, like Notion would be good. They're a good example of a customer that really needs to have an in house team. But several of the other companies I work for never really grew to the point that they would have needed that.
mhm. Well, thanks, Brian, for coming here,
Yeah, thank
explaining
you.
us about yourself, your new business, what you've done, and I really like your flexibility, your approach, and I hope and I wish the best to you for this new venture. And from the
Yeah,
bottom of
thank you.
my heart, we're here to help you anytime as well. If you need it, you know us, you know where to find us as well. So thanks, Brian. I look forward to seeing you in person very soon as well. Thanks to all of you watching for being in another episode of Merging Minds. Until the next time, bye.